Confessions, the agenda-challenging, unexpected memoir from one of our best-loved broadcasters, brought face-to-face with the author of his obituary and his own inevitable mortality. Edward Stoughton has prompted to reflect on a life he has led and the events that have shaped him. It's a fascinating book. It's an amazing career, and I'm delighted to be joining me live on the line from somewhere in the UK, Edward Stoughton himself. Ed, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. I'm freezing in my writing shed is where I am in the UK, where I wrote the book.
You have a writing shed at the far end of the garden, because when you are composing, you can't have anybody around you, or nobody wants to be around you, and they banish you.
It's a great treat. It's a great sort of retreat. Carpenter made it. He bought a bus stop and stuck a couple of doors on the front, and it works a treat.
And you know the thing with buses, you wait for one, and then three come along at the same time. I mean, has your career kind of been like that as well? I mean, what you're pausing to reflect at this particular point in your career, in your life thus far, and you've had a sort of, as we all must do at some point, face up to our own mortality moment.
Well, that story about the obituary, I mean, in retrospect, it was quite funny, but I was at a party, a friend's book launch, actually, and an old friend said he'd been asked to write our host's obituary for a national newspaper. And then he paused and he said, and I offered to write yours, but they said you'd already been done. And I couldn't make up my mind whether to be sort of flattered that I had one at all, or rather alarmed at the prospect that they thought they might need it soon. So that's what kicked it off.
Yes, you can imagine sub-editors itching to hit the send button, can't you? Pause it,
Yeah, you do. And he said, I told him, do I actually care what they say? Because I won't be around to read it, so maybe I don't. But it prompted a sort of, I think, a thing that all journalists have, which is a desire to make sense of a story. That's what you do every day when you broadcast a report or you write a piece of the newspaper. You get a collection of disparate facts and you turn them into a kind of narrative that's going to make sense to the reader or the listener or the viewer. And I sort of thought, well, perhaps I will do that with my life, which is what I tried to do.
It's interesting because when you work in radio and when you're a broadcaster, I've always said that, radio is the most intimate of media because it's not like TV, which shouts and screams, look at me, look at me. You have a relationship with your listeners because the voice is the most intimate method of communication. And we let radio into our lives in a way that we don't think about to a large extent. We think we know the person who's on the other end, who's broadcasting to us, and they are part of our routine, my routine in the Freelander, driving up the track to get on the main road to come and do my shows. And you were an integral part of that with your radio broadcasting. But I actually knew, in the nicest possible way, very little about you. So when I was handed the press notes for this, you're born in the sons of expat parents in the colonial Nigeria and also at Ampleforth. And it just made me think, we think we know people because of the intrusive way that media and social media operates these days. But actually we don't know unless we take the time, we don't know the real person very much indeed.
That's all true. I mean, I just pick you up on what you say about radio because I think it's so true and so important. That I used to work in telly. In fact, that's where I began at ITN, doing the news and then on Channel 4 News. And in a funny sort of way, telly is a cold medium. I think it's Marshall McLuhan who used to use that phrase. And it puts a barrier between you and the viewer in an odd sort of way. And I found that if people came up to me in the street, it was usually to tip me off for wearing a loud tie or the wrong kind of jacket or something of that kind. And as soon as I moved and began working mostly in radio, the conversations changed completely. People would come up to you and discuss a question that you asked or a report that you'd done, precisely because of that very incredibly intimate relationship that you talk about. And I think, I mean, in terms of knowing people, you can hide yourself on telly. I mean, certainly as a news reporter. You can't hide on radio. You just can't. It finds you out. And it gives you that very, very close relationship with the listeners. After all, they listen to you when they're in their bath, when they're on the loo, when they're having breakfast,
Yes. and we hope some of the finest broadcasters. We think you think you're putting out the finest broadcast known to man, and somebody is probably doing something crossword in the smallest room in the house.
Exactly.
And it also leads to that famous saying, oh, you don't look like you sound.
That is what do you make of that? I mean, is that good or bad? I think the nicest thing, once or twice I've had said to me about radio broadcasts, is people who were listening in the car on a journey, and they said, when I got to my destination, I was so gripped I couldn't get out of the car. I stayed in to hear the end of the program. And that, it doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, that really tells you that you are making that intimate relationship work, and it's paid off.
From Nigeria, you went to Ampleforth, one of the best known public schools, obviously, in the UK, and then on to Cambridge as well. And did that sort of set you up with an? And I hate to use the word, because it's been misconstrued. Oh, there's an elite network, but obviously, if you're at Cambridge and a top public school, you're going to get access, and you're going to know how to speak to future ministers, future church leaders, future diplomats.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think we were I don't know whether we were an unusual generation, but a lot of us went on to do stuff. And I mean, one of the strangest thing is that my own college at Cambridge, which was the biggest, but it wasn't absolutely huge. There was somebody in the year above me called Justin Welby, and who became Archbishop of Canterbury, and none of us remember him at all. It's a sort of strange thing like that. No, I think that's true, and I think we ought to be honest about the fact that we all loved networking. It was considered a perfectly respectable thing to do back in those days. The most shocking, I think, thing I found out about my own past in that sort of regard was that when I got a traineeship at ITN, which was, a much prized job. The managing editor's secretary became a friend later, and she said to me that she'd been told to go through all the applications and throw away any that hadn't been to Oxford or Cambridge. I'm happy to say you can't imagine anything like that these days. Well, yeah. But there's no question it was a real advantage there.
And that's one of the things, isn't it? Because the way that we do business at any level now, and the way that we report news and the way that we take in news has changed in our lifetimes beyond recognition. I mean, when you went into journalism and got that internship on ITN, I mean, the media was a noble calling, and now, if you believe half the things that I get on social media, we are slightly beneath pond life on the great. If we're not conniving with the Illuminati or the MSN, then we're up to something even worse.
Well, I'm not sure I buy that. It's certainly true that when I started at ITN, television news, and let's remember in those days there were only 3 television channels. Television news had, all the polls showed, huge public trust, much more than the newspapers. But I think there's still a bit of that around today, and in a funny sort of way, in a fractured media world, people have begun, I think, to turn to sources they know they can trust. So, the good old BBC, maybe a bit slow sometimes about getting the news, but that's because things are being checked. And it still is where you go to when you want to be sure that something's really true. I mean, you might follow Twitter, you might follow all sorts of outlets and different ways of getting your news and different ways of consuming it. But if you really want to be sure of what you're hearing and know that it's been edited in the best sense, by which I mean somebody who knows the subject, has gone through the stories, has selected which are most important and why they're important, then you still come to places like ITN and the BBC.
What was your can you remember what your first reports were when you were sent out with a mic and a sound and a sound recordist and obviously to report broadcast news at that point you needed a team, you couldn't just do it on your iPhone.
I do remember a few. I mean, we I remember one morning when one of the Red Tops had run a story. I don't know if it was the Sun or the Mirror, I can't remember, but run a story that Brixton prisoners were slipping out over the wall in the evenings for a drink in the pub and then going back in again. And the news editor shouted at me across the newsroom, "Oh, you trainee, go to Brixton and find an escaped prisoner." Which,
yes,
I confess. I think the first one I managed to get on the air was I managed to discover that there was a commodities market being set up in potatoes. Like you have commodities in all sorts of things. I don't know, pork bellies and gold and goodness knows what else. And they were establishing one in spuds.
Right.
This was considered sufficiently odd, but it got me the nickname Spudster. But anyway, it got me on the air for the first time, so who cares?
Indeed, and from there, of course, you continued. Again, foreign reporting, finding yourself in, and I know that the media at the moment is dominated what's happening in Ukraine, but going to a conflict zone, going to a war zone is always challenging, but at the same time, it's a job that war reporting is valid. It's not a war junkie adrenaline rush type of situation.
Well, it's funny when I think back to then. Nowadays, and it's quite right. If you go to a war zone, you'll go to a training camp. You'll be put through make up hostage scenarios so that you know how to react. You'll be taught battlefield first aid, which is incredibly useful. But, back then, I mean, there was none of that sort of thing. And I remember the first time I went to a war zone, which was actually Beirut in Lebanon during the Civil War. And I went down to the stores and said, have you got anything I should take? And the guy produced what looked to me a bit like a thick vest. And he said, I used to have a list of what this thing would stop, but I've lost the list. And it'll be just my luck if whatever hits you isn't on the list. Okay.
Huge confidence booster that must have been.
Huge confidence booster. And, I just went off pretty much on my own and worked out what to do, which, in retrospect, it was very exciting. It was a great privilege. You learnt the ropes pretty quickly. But it was a very different world. And, you wouldn't do that today, really. It's a different, yeah. I mean, I'm pleased I had that experience. I really am.
But if you think about it during that time, of course, as well, it's the 70s and the 80s, and the media is developing and the technology is developing, and for the first time, rather than being talked at, if you sat at home on your sofa, you were almost an eyewitness to history in a direct way that hadn't been possible before in the early 60s, for example.
Yeah, that's true. Although it was on the coming. When I started, which was 79, I joined ICN. It was kind of on the cusp of change, and it wasn't anywhere close to where it is today. So, for example, if you were in Beirut, you shot on electronic news gathering, as we called it, the sort of forerunner of digital stuff in the way that you do today. We just moved beyond the old film, which has been used right up until then. But there were no satellites or anything like that working in Beirut. So if you wanted to get your material home, you had to persuade. You gave it to a taxi driver, paid him several $100s to drive the tapes over the Shuf Mountains and through the Bekaa Valley to Damascus, where it would arrive. Well, him having, of course, driven through an active war zone to get there, where the tapes would arrive several hours later. And with a bit of luck, somebody would send them to London. So it was still a little bit of a cleft stick era, if you like, but just beginning to move into, of course, as you say, the world that we enjoy today, where just come in. Well, and again, sorry, you stop me because I'm running away with myself. But I think that in terms of comparisons, it's worth saying that the other side of the coin is that there are large parts of the world today which are so dangerous, and as it happens, Syria is one of them, that actually they do go uncovered because people have tried and lots of people have done it very bravely, but there are large parts of the world which are uncovered because of the danger.
But in a world where people are TikToking and social mediaing, it is still vitally important to have foreign bureaus and to have investigative journalists and have people. I don't mean sort of slugging through the foothills of the Bekaa Valley or whatever, but even on our own, even on domestic news, rather than just relying on a social media post and just bashing it out there, get it out there first before you find out what's actually going on. But actually yes.
That's sort of what I meant about the the continuing relevance of organisations like the BBC. I mean, amid the plethora of stuff being pushed out, people, although it can be very thrilling and it's a junky thing and you love reading it, and sometimes very exciting to get the news first like that, people do after a while say, yeah, but can I be sure about this? It needs checking. Let's find out. And it's true. I mean, it's true in a lot of the war coverage where social media has been done by local people because there aren't journalists around and they post pictures of what's happening. Checking that stuff is really difficult, but it's really important.
What about, have you been in a situation, I'm thinking Hong Kong, where you actually realise that you are, because you can have a breaking news story and then it turns into history. Situations like Hong Kong, for example, were you aware that this was a potentious time, and you were sort of you would be making broadcasting history, or you'd be there to create, one of the great events of empire?
I actually think the period when I've been most acutely aware of that was the end of the Soviet Union, which I was very much involved in covering, because this vast evil empire, as Ronald Reagan called it, which had dominated all our lives, which had put us in sort of constant fear of a nuclear holocaust. It was suddenly fading away. And to be there and watch that happen was extraordinary. And also to discover, we talk now about the Iron Curtain across Europe. It really was an Iron Curtain, and there were huge bits of Europe that now people go to for goodness knows what, stag weekends and so forth, that were simply out of bounds, that we'd never seen. And suddenly it all opened up, and that was just an incredible thrill to see. That was a real feeling of history being made.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because people tend to think about the 80s as it all being sort of mobile phones, silly hairstyles, and shoulder pads. But at the time, it was the camp. It's a true story. It was the camp. It was mutually assured destruction. It was the Berlin Wall. It was solidarity, and there was the Berlin Wall wasn't something that tourists can bring a fraction back. On their holidays. I mean, it was they used to look wistfully at our cousins across in what was then East Germany, And so therefore it was Cold War. But you must have, the other thing is we look back and at that period of the Soviet Union disintegrating, but we had no idea what was coming next. Now we know how it played out. But at that point, you had no idea whether the generals would come back in, whether it would all fall apart. And so there is that, isn't there? There's that as well.
Well, I mean, that's a sort of reminder of a terrible, sad truth, which is that if you've done enough knocking around in journalism, you have covered so many stories which look so full of hope when you're there, and which then go horribly wrong. And the story of what's happened in Russia, I think, is a very good example of that. We really felt then that Russia would be part of the community of nations, if you like, and then look where we are today. Another example of that, I think, was I, with a group of other journalists, made my way down to Kabul in Afghanistan from the Khyber Pass, just as the Taliban fell at the end of the American war there in 2001. And, you was such hope in Kabul then, and the idea that women might have a sort of brighter future in Afghanistan was very much alive. And again, look where we are today. You hang around long enough in journalism and you will be disappointed, I'm afraid.
And today, you were the voice, you were the comforting warm blanket that many of us turned to in the morning as we were trying to get the car started and catch up with what was coming up in the day. That was an experience. Very early morning starts and putting that one together.
Great experience, I have to say. And I mean, as long as you were sensible about what time you went to bed, and maybe one glass of wine, but no more than that.
Before the show or the morning before?
But I used to really enjoy those early mornings, mostly, and the great sense of excitement about what you were doing. I did have one terrible experience when a very old friend came to dinner. It was a Sunday night, and I wasn't rostered on the next morning, so we did a bit of reminiscing, and there was a Calvados or two that went down. And I can't remember what time we got to bed, but I suspect probably about 1 o'clock. And at 4:30 the phone went, and one of my colleagues had forgotten that he was supposed to be on shift that morning, and they said, and he's in France.
Oh, no.
I said, I wouldn't drive a car, but if you want me to try and drive the nation's #1 radio program, I'll give it a go. It wasn't fun. I did it, but it wasn't fun.
Yeah, I think adrenaline and pure thing take over from there. That's right. You've described why you put the book together, but when you put it all down, because it's different, isn't it? Was it difficult to sort of have a dispassionate look at your career thus far and your life thus far? Yeah,
it was, and I was I set out thinking I am uniquely well qualified to tell the story of my own life. Actually, that turned out to be completely untrue. I really needed the help of a wonderful editor who I've worked with many times before at my publishers, Transworld. And also, I'm lucky enough to be married to an executive producer in television who is a great storyteller. And she kind of helped me work out which bits to keep in and also which bits to leave out to avoid embarrassing myself. So I had a lot of. It's funny. You wouldn't have thought it, would you? You thought writing your own life is something you do on your own. But actually, I had a lot of help from. I call them both my super editors in working out how to do it, which was good actually, and it means that it's not. There's a bit more objectivity in there, perhaps, than there might have been otherwise. Well,
also, if you sit down with a group of friends over a Calvados or something, so you'll be telling a story, and somebody said, "Oh, and then we did this," and you go, "Oh, of course we did," and then we did that, and then we ended up, in wherever on earth you ended up with. So I suppose it's a team effort.
Yes, and actually, do you know what? I think you don't want to write an autobiography or memoir quite in the way that you've just described. Do you know what I mean? It's quite dull, somebody's life, if you literally say, and the next thing I did was this. You have to give it slightly more thematic shape and give the stories a bit of meaning, maybe. And also, I think the reader's got a right to expect to hear a little bit about what you might have learnt from whichever experience it is. I mean, you can just string together a bunch of journalistic anecdotes if you want, but I think that's slightly shortchanging, the person who spends 20 quid or whatever is on your book. I think they expect a bit more than that.
And so if you have, and here comes the killer question, if you have learned something then, Edward, because you did say that, they want to find out what you've learned. What have you learned, and what would you, if you had to pick a moment that you stood still, looked around and thought, I really am privileged to be doing what I'm doing?
I think the experience of reporting has been a continuous life lesson. And in a funny sort of way, it doesn't matter whether you're reporting on the fall of the Berlin Wall or a tiny community in some far-off place whose lives you're just checking into. It's that feeling of encountering other people, of being forced to rethink your own prejudices and your own preconceptions, and keep learning all the time what the world's like. And I think I'm going to say at the end of the book, I found myself winding up, actually cherishing uncertainty, actually enjoying the fact that the world is so much more complicated than I thought it was when I set out, and that it's never over. You never stop learning.
The book is Confessions, Life Re-Examined. It's by Ed Stoughton. And if people want to find you online, do you have a website? Do you TikTok? Can people find you online?
None of the above.
Marvelous.
I believe I cannot think that anybody should be interested in anything I've got to say unless I've thought about it really carefully, which is why I do books and not social media.
The book is called Confessions. It's by Ed Stoughton. Ed, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to speak to you this morning.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.